Westward expansion, carrying mail to the frontier, 1800 to 1840. The year is 1800. The map of the United States is a document of edges. To the east, the Atlantic Ocean beats against the wharves of Boston and Charleston. To the west, the world dissolves into a vast green mystery. Between the settled civilization of the coast and the wild territories of the interior stood a wall of stone and timber, the Appalachian Mountains. For generations, this range had been the psychological and physical limit of the colonies. But as the 19th century dawned, the pressure to move was building. The American people were restless. They looked at the blue ridges of the mountains not as a boundary, but as a threshold. Chapter 3 of our history is the story of crossing that threshold. It is a story of logistics played out on a continental scale. It is the story of how the United States Postal Service stretched itself thin, pulling the thread of communication over jagged peaks, through dense primeval forests, and down muddy riverbanks to ensure that the settler in a log cabin in Ohio remained connected to the merchant in Philadelphia. To understand this era, we must first visualize the sheer density of the wilderness. This was not the open farmland we see today. In 1800, the territory west of the mountains, Kentucky, Tennessee, and the future state of Ohio, was covered in a canopy of trees so thick that sunlight often failed to reach the ground. It was a perpetual twilight. Giant oaks, sycamores, and chestnuts created a cathedral of silence. Into this silence rode the post rider. The logistics of moving mail across the Appalachians required a specific route. The most famous of these was the Cumberland Gap. It was a natural break in the mountain wall, a geological doorway located at the junction of Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee. Through this gap passed the Wilderness Road. The name is romantic, but the reality was brutal. The Wilderness Road was a track of mud, rock, and roots. It was narrow, often allowing only a single horse or a small cart to pass. In the winter, it was choked with snow. In the spring, it was a river of sludge. The mail contract for this route was not for the faint of heart. A rider carrying the mail from Virginia to Kentucky faced a journey of hundreds of miles through terrain that offered no comfort. The logistics were simple, but unforgiving. The mail bag was strapped to the saddle. The rider carried a blanket, a knife, perhaps a piece of dried meat, and a small horn. He rode alone. The rhythm of the ride was slow. The horse had to pick its way carefully over the limestone rocks. If the horse went lame, the mail stopped. There were no repair shops, no replacement mounts waiting in the woods. The rider was the entire infrastructure. As the mail moved deeper into the frontier, the post office itself underwent a transformation. In Philadelphia or New York, a post office was a distinct building or a dedicated section of a shop. In the frontier territories of 1810 or 1820, a post office was wherever the postmaster happened to be. Often the post office was a shelf in a general store. Sometimes it was a wooden box nailed to the wall of a tavern. In some remote settlements, the office was simply the pocket of a trusted citizen's coat. Let us imagine the arrival of the mail in a frontier settlement in the Ohio Valley. The village is small, a cluster of 10 or 12 log cabins near a creek. The air smells of wood smoke and damp earth. The sound of a horn drifts from the forest edge. Work stops. The blacksmith puts down his hammer. The women step out of the cabins, wiping flour from their hands. The arrival of the post rider was the only event that mattered. He brought the Eastern papers. He brought letters that had been written 3 months ago, telling of births, deaths, and elections that had long since passed. The postmaster of the village would unlock the leather portmanteau. He would dump the contents onto a table, usually a rough-hewn slab of wood. The villagers would gather around, staring at the letters. In an era where paper was scarce and expensive, a letter was a physical treasure. The paper was often folded and refolded until it was soft as cloth. The handwriting was tiny to maximize the space. If a letter arrived for a settler who lived 20 miles away in the woods, it would sit in the pigeonhole,
a small wooden cubby, waiting. Sometimes it waited for weeks. Sometimes a neighbor passing through would say, "I'm heading up the creek to the Miller place," and they would take the letter. The Postal Service relied heavily on this informal network of neighbors. But as the population grew, the single rider on a horse was no longer enough. The mail needed a highway. Enter the National Road. Construction began in 1811. It was the first federally funded highway in the United States, a project of immense ambition, designed to connect the Potomac River to the Ohio River. This was the main street of America. The logistics of the National Road were a marvel of 19th century engineering. It was not a dirt path. It was paved using the macadam method, layers of crushed stone that were compacted by traffic to create a hard, durable surface. For the first time, heavy wagons could travel west without sinking to their axles in mud. The mail coaches that plied the National Road were larger and more robust than their predecessors. These were the Concord coaches, built with a suspension system of leather straps that allowed the carriage to swing and sway rather than jolt. They were painted in bright colors, usually red with yellow wheels and scrolled with gold leaf. They were beautiful machines moving through a rugged landscape. The traffic on the National Road was dense. A mail coach driver in 1830 had to navigate a river of humanity. There were the massive Conestoga wagons, the 18-wheelers of their day, pulled by teams of 6 sturdy horses and carrying thousands of pounds of freight. There were droves of pigs and cattle being walked to market, kicking up clouds of dust that coated the throat. There were families walking with handcarts. The mail coach had the right of way. When the driver blew his horn, the freight wagons were expected to pull to the side. The mail had to get through. The schedule was sacred. Contracts for carrying the mail on these main routes were highly competitive. The Post Office Department in Washington, D.C. would issue advertisements for bids. They introduced a phrase in these contracts that would become legendary. The contractor was required to carry the mail with certainty, celerity, and security. Celerity means speed. In the official record books, the clerks got tired of writing certainty, celerity, and security over and over again, so they began to abbreviate it with 3 asterisks or stars, STAR. Thus, these routes became known as the star routes. While the roads were being built, another revolution was taking place on the water. The geography of the American West is dominated by rivers, the Ohio, the Missouri, and the mighty Mississippi. These were the natural highways of the continent. But until the early 1800s, they were one-way streets. A flatboat could float down the Mississippi from St. Louis to New Orleans, carried by the current. But to get back up, that was a journey of months, requiring men to pull the boat with ropes against the raging current. Then, in 1811, the steamboat New Orleans was launched on the Ohio River. It changed everything. The steamboat conquered the current. It could travel upstream, and the post office immediately saw the potential. In 1823, Congress declared all navigable waters to be post roads. This was a legal fiction. Water is not a road, but it allowed the government to regulate mail transport on the rivers. Moving mail by steamboat was a different logistical beast than moving it by horse. The steamboats were floating palaces of wood and steam, but they were also incredibly dangerous. The rivers were filled with snags and sawyers, sunken trees that could rip the hull of a boat open like paper. Boilers exploded with terrifying frequency. Yet the mail was piled onto the decks. Large canvas sacks, sealed with lead, were stacked near the paddle wheels. The captains of these steamboats took great pride in their mail packet designation. Flying the mail flag meant your boat was fast and reliable. Imagine standing on the bank of the Mississippi River in 1835. It is night. The river is a wide, black ribbon moving silently in the dark. In the distance, you hear the rhythmic chug, chug, chug of a steam engine. A whistle blows, a low, mournful sound. Then, around the bend, the boat appears, its twin smokestacks belching sparks that drift into the night sky like fireflies. It pulls alongside the muddy bank just long enough to toss a heavy sack of mail onto the dock and take on a new one. Then, with a churning of water, it backs away and disappears into the darkness. This was the pulse of the frontier. However, not all expansion was west. There was also the Old Southwest, Mississippi, Alabama, and the Natchez Trace. The Natchez Trace is perhaps the most atmospheric of all the early mail routes. It was an ancient trail, used originally by bison and Native Americans, stretching from Nashville, Tennessee to Natchez, Mississippi. It cut through deep forests and cypress swamps. The riders who carried the mail on the trace were known as post riders, but they were also adventurers. The trace was lonely. It was often sunken deep into the earth with high banks on either side, creating a tunnel of green foliage. It was a place of bandits and highwaymen, though the threat was often exaggerated by folklore. The real enemies were the mosquitoes, the heat, and the fever. The mail on the trace moved in relays. Stations were set up every 15 to 20 miles. These stations were often called stands. A stand was a simple inn offering corn mush for the rider and corn for the horse. The Mount Locust stand in Mississippi is a surviving example, a quiet wooden house on a hill where the mail rider would rest for a few hours before mounting a fresh horse and plunging back into the humidity of the swamp. By 1830, the volume of mail was increasing dramatically. This was due to the lowering of postage rates. No, postage was still incredibly expensive. In the 1820s and 30s, sending a single-sheet letter more than 400 miles cost 25 cents. To put that in perspective, a skilled laborer might earn $1 a day. Sending a letter was an investment. It cost a quarter of a day's wages. Because of this high cost, people developed a habit of cross-writing to save paper. A writer would fill the page horizontally from left to right, then they would turn the paper 90 degrees and write over the first lines vertically. The result was a grid of text that was headache-inducing to read, but it allowed 2 pages of news to fit on 1 sheet of paper. The high cost also meant that the arrival of a letter was a serious financial transaction. Remember, the recipient usually paid the postage. Imagine a settler in Illinois struggling to make ends meet, hearing that a letter had arrived from his brother in Boston. He goes to the post office. The postmaster holds up the letter. "That will be 25 cents, he says. The settler has to decide, is the news inside worth the money? Usually, the answer was yes. The hunger for connection outweighed the cost. As we move toward 1840, the scale of the coastal network becomes truly continental. In 1803, the United States had purchased the Louisiana Territory from France. Overnight, the size of the nation doubled. The border was no longer the Mississippi River, it was the Rocky Mountains. How do you get mail to St. Louis, the gateway to this new vastness, and beyond St. Louis to the fur trappers and the remote forts on the Missouri River? The logistics became a game of endurance. The mail moved from the East Coast over the macadam of the National Road to Wheeling, West Virginia, then onto a steamboat down the Ohio River to Louisville in Cairo, then up the Mississippi to St. Louis. From St. Louis, the mail became sporadic. It traveled in the saddlebags of military couriers or on the decks of fur-trading keelboats. It moved at the speed of the currents and the wind. A letter from Washington, D.C. to a fort in the Dakotas might take 3 months to arrive. But the most remarkable thing is that it did arrive. There is a profound quietness to this era of history. We are before the telegraph, which would arrive in 1844. We are before the railroad became dominant. The world was still governed by the speed of biological life. The 1830s saw the peak of the stagecoach era. The staging companies became powerful corporations. They managed thousands of horses and hundreds of drivers. They built barns and blacksmith shops along the routes. They were the logistical giants of the age. The drivers of these coaches were local celebrities. They were known for their skill with the ribbons, the reins, and their long whips which they could crack with the sound of a pistol shot, not to hit the horses, but to signal their approach. They wore wide-brimmed hats and heavy wool coats. They sat high up on the box, exposed to the rain, the sleet, and the burning sun, while the passengers inside dozed against the leather cushions. One specific logistical challenge of the frontier was the lack of addresses. In a city, you had a street and a number. In the frontier territories, you had a name and a general area. A letter might be addressed simply to John Smith near the Big Creek, west of the Red Barn, Ohio Territory. It was the job of the local postmaster to decipher this geography. He was a detective of location. He knew who lived near the Big Creek. He knew who had built a red barn last autumn. The postal system relied on local knowledge. It was human-centric. By 1840, the post road network had grown from a few thousand miles to over 150,000 miles. It was a spider web that covered the eastern half of the continent. It had crossed the Appalachians. It had crossed the Mississippi. The silence of the wilderness was being filled. It was filled with the creaking of wagon wheels, the blast of steamboat whistles, and the horn of the post rider. This era, from 1800 to 1840, was the childhood of the American expanse. It was a time of mud and wood. It was a time when the distance between two people was measured in the number of days a horse could walk. As we bring this chapter to a close, let us rest our minds on a single image. It is a winter evening in 1838. We are in a small cabin in the Indiana Territory. Outside, the wind is howling through the bare branches of the hickory trees. Snow is piling up against the door. Inside, a fire is burning in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering orange light on the rough log walls. A man sits at a wooden table. In his hands, he holds a letter. The seal is broken. The paper is worn. He has read it 3 times already. It is a letter from his father in Vermont. It took 6 weeks to get here. It traveled by carriage to Albany, by canal boat to Buffalo, by lake schooner to Cleveland, by wagon to the village, and finally, in the pocket of a neighbor, to this cabin. The man reads the words again. He is connected. The vast, terrifying silence of the frontier has been breached by a piece of paper. The fire crackles, the wind blows, but the line holds. The mail has arrived.